Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the next thrilling, exciting, ebullient, effervescent, and effulgent episode of the inimitable, irrevocable, inimical, irreproachable reading cow from the world with bedtime stories. The show that this is today. We're gonna find out what Uncle Sam really wants. We begin the main goals of U.S. foreign policy. From the cow to you. Protecting our turf. Relations between the United States and other countries obviously go back to the origins of American history. But World War II was a real watershed, so let's begin there. While most of our industrial rivals were either severely weakened or totally destroyed by the war, the United States benefited enormously from it. Our national territory was never under attack, and American production more than tripled. Even before the war, the U.S. had been by far the leading industrial nation in the world, as it had been since the turn of the century. Now, however, we had literally 50% of the world's wealth and controlled both sides of both oceans. There had never been a time in history when one power had had such overwhelming control of the world, or such overwhelming security. The people who determined American policy were well aware that the U.S. would emerge from World War II as the first global power in history, and during and after the war they were carefully planning how to shape the post-war world. Since this is an open society, we can read their plans, which were very frank and clear. American planners, from those in the State Department to those on the Council on Foreign Relations, one major channel by which business leaders influence foreign policy, agreed that the dominance of the United States had to be maintained. But there was a spectrum of opinion about how to do it. At the hard-line extreme, you have documents like the National Security Council Memorandum 68, 1950. NSC 68 developed the views of Secretary of State D. Atchison and was written by Paul Nietzsche, who's still around. He was one of Reagan's arms control negotiators. It called for a rollback strategy that would foster the needs of destruction within the Soviet system. Foster the seeds of destruction within the Soviet system, so that we could then negotiate a settlement on our terms with the Soviet Union or a successor state or states. The policies recommended by NSC 68 would require sacrifice and discipline in the United States. In other words, huge military expenditures and cutbacks on social services. It would also be necessary to overcome the excess of tolerance that allows too much domestic dissent. Don't want that. These policies were in fact already being implemented in 1949 as U.S. espionage in Eastern Europe had been turned over to a network run by Reinhard Gehlen, who had headed Nazi military intelligence on the Eastern Front. This network was one part of the U.S. Nazi alliance that quickly absorbed many of the worst criminals, extending to operations in Latin America and elsewhere. These operations included a secret army under U.S. Nazi auspices that sought to provide agents and military supplies to armies that had been established by and were still operating inside the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe through the early 1950s. This is known in the U.S., but considered insignificant, although it might raise a few eyebrows if the tables were turned and we discovered that, say, the Soviet Union had dropped agents and supplies to armies established by Hitler that were operating in the Rocky Mountains. Imagine that. The liberal extreme. NS-68 is the hard line extreme. And remember, the policies weren't just theoretical. Many of them were actually being implemented. Now let's turn to the other extreme, to the doves. The leading dove was undoubtedly George Kennan, who headed the State Department planning staff until 1950, when he was replaced by Nietzsche. Kennan's office, incidentally, was responsible for the Galen Network. Kennan was one of the most intelligent and lucid U.S. planners, and a major figure in shaping the post-war world. His writings are an extremely interesting illustration of the dovish position. One document to look at if you want to understand your country is Policy Planning Study number 23, written by Kennan for the State Department of Planning staff in 1948. Here's some of what it says. We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we're going to have to deal in straight power concepts. The less we are then hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. PPS 23 was, of course, a top-secret document. To pacify the public, it was necessary to trumpet the idealistic slogans, as is still being done constantly. But here, planners were talking to one another. Along the same lines, in the briefing for U.S. ambassadors to Latin American countries in 1950, Kennan observed that a major concern of U.S. foreign policy must be the protection of our, i.e. Latin America's, raw materials. We must therefore combat the dangerous heresy which U.S. intelligence reported was spreading through Latin America, the idea that the government has direct responsibility for the welfare of the people. Those radicals, their ideas are spreading. They're spreading. U.S. planners called that idea communism. Whatever the actual political views of the people advocating it, doesn't matter whatever the actual political views are. They're communists by definition. They can be church-based self-help groups or whatever, but if they support this heresy, they're communists. This point is also made clear in the public record. For example, a high-level study group in 1955 stated that the essential threat of communist powers, the real meaning of the term communism in practice, is their refusal to fulfill their service role, that is, to complement the industrial economies of the West. The note is not here, but folks, this is in the early chapters of a book called The Political Economy of U.S. Foreign Policy from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. Definitely worth reading. Kennan went on to explain the means we have to use against our enemies who all prey to this heresy. The final answer might be an unpleasant one, but we should not hesitate before police repression by the local government. This is not shameful, since the communists are essentially traitors. It is better to have a strong regime in power than a liberal government if it is indulgent and relaxed and penetrated by people who think the government should take care of the people. Communists. Policies like these didn't begin with post-war liberals like Kennan. As Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State had already pointed out 30 years earlier, the operative meaning of the Monroe Doctrine is that the United States considers its own interests. The integrity of other American nations is incident, not an end. Wilson, the great apostle of self-determination, agreed that the argument was unanswerable, though it would be impolitic to present it publicly. Wilson also acted on this by thinking by, among other things, invading Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where his warriors murdered and destroyed, demolished the political system, left U.S. corporations firmly in control, and set the stage for brutal and corrupt dictatorships. Man, folks, Haiti got it so bad, you can see Haiti's devastation from outer space. Went from being the most wealthy colony, in history to total devastation. We took care of them. The grand area. During World War II, study groups of the State Department and Council on Foreign Relations developed plans for the post-war world in terms of what they called the Grand Area, which was to be subordinated to the needs of the American economy. The Grand Area was to include the Western Hemisphere, Western Europe, the Far East, the former British Empire, which was being dismantled, the incomparable energy resources of the Middle East, which were then passing into American hands as we pushed our rivals, France and Britain, out. The rest of the Third World, and possibly the entire globe. These plans were implemented as opportunities allowed. Every part of the New World Order was assigned a specific function. The industrial countries were to be guided by the great workshops, Germany and Japan, who had demonstrated their prowess during the war and now would be working under U.S. supervision. The Third World was to fulfill its major function as a source of raw materials and a market for the industrial capitalist societies. As a 1949 State Department memo put it, it was to be exploited, in Kennan's words, for the reconstruction of Europe and Japan. The references are to Southeast Asia and Africa, but the points are general. Kennan even suggested that Europe might get a psychological lift from the project of exploiting Africa. Naturally, no one suggested that Africa should exploit Europe for its reconstruction, perhaps also improving its state of mind. These declassified documents are read only by scholars who apparently find nothing odd or jarring in this. It's normal. It's normal. It's all so clear to me now. The Vietnam War emerged from the need to ensure the service role. Vietnamese nationalists didn't want to accept it, so they had to be smashed. The threat wasn't that they were going to conquer anyone, but they might set a dangerous example of national independence that would inspire other nations in the region. The domino effect, folks. The threat of a good example. The U.S. government had two major roles to play. The first was to secure the far-flung domains of the Grand Area that required a very intimidating posture to ensure that no one interferes with this task, which is one reason why there's been such a drive for nuclear weapons. The government's second role was to organize a public subsidy for high technology industry. For various reasons, the method adopted has been military spending in large part. We have to develop our high technology because the Russians are coming. Not, you don't want to say you got to develop high technology to be competitive or, to be a leader in the world or to help the people. So, the boogeyman is going to get you, so give us all your money for the military. And, okay, so that's how we do it here. It's kind of done. Okay. Free trade is fine for economics departments and newspaper editorials, but nobody in the corporate world or the government takes the doctrine seriously. The parts of the U.S. economy that are able to compete internationally are primarily the state-subsidized ones. Capital-intensive agriculture, agribusiness as it's called, high-tech industries, pharmaceuticals and biotechnology, etc. The same is true of other industrial societies. The U.S. government has the public pay for research and development and provides largely through the military a state-guaranteed market for waste production. If something is marketable, the private sector takes it over. That system of public subsidy and private profit is what is called free enterprise. Restoring the traditional order. Post-war planners like Kennan realized right off that it was going to be vital for the health of U.S. corporations that other Western industrial societies reconstruct from wartime damage so they could import U.S. manufactured goods and provide investment opportunities. I'm counting Japan as part of the West. Following the South African Convention of treating the Japanese as honorary whites, but it was crucial that these societies reconstruct in a very specific way. The traditional right-wing order had to be restored, with business dominant, labor split and weakened, and the burden of reconstruction placed squarely on the shoulders of the working classes and the poor. The major thing that stood in the way of this was the anti-fascist resistance, so we suppressed it all over the world, often installing fascist and Nazi collaborators in its place. Sometimes that required extreme violence, but other times it was done by softer measures, like subverting elections and withholding desperately needed food. This ought to be chapter 1 in any honest history of the post-war period, but in fact it's seldom even discussed. The pattern was set in 1942 when President Roosevelt installed French Admiral Jean Darlan as Governor General of all of French North Africa. Darlan was a leading Nazi collaborator and author of the anti-Semitic laws promulgated by the Vichy government, the Nazis' puppet regime in France. But far more important was the first area of Europe liberated, southern Italy, where the U.S., following Churchill's advice, imposed a right-wing dictatorship headed by fascist war hero Field Marshal Badoglio and the King. Badoglio and the King. Victor Emmanuel III, who was also a fascist collaborator. Oh, fancy that. Huh. How did they turn up all of a sudden? Wonder. The things that happen, bumbling efforts to do good. U.S. planners recognized that the threat in Europe was not Soviet aggression, which serious analysts like Dwight Eisenhower did not anticipate, but rather the worker and peasant-based anti-fascist resistance with its radical democratic ideals, and the political power and appeal of the local communist parties to prevent an economic collapse that would enhance their influence and to rebuild Western Europe's state capitalist economies. The U.S. instituted the Marshall Plan, under which Europe was provided with more than $12 billion in loans and grants between 1948 and 1951, funds used to purchase a third of the U.S. exports to Europe in the peak of the year 1949. It's so awesome. You get that. This big Marshall Plan, and it's to buy the company's stuff. Yeah, okay. In Italy, a worker-peasant-based movement led by the Communist Party had held down 6 German divisions during the war and liberated northern Italy. As U.S. forces advanced through Italy, they dispersed this anti-fascist resistance and restored the basic structure of the pre-war fascist regime. Italy has been one of the main areas of CIA subversion ever since the agency was founded. The CIA was concerned about communists winning power legally in the crucial Italian elections of 1948. A lot of good techniques were used, including restoring the fascist police, breaking the unions, and withholding food. But it wasn't clear that the Communist Party could be defeated. The very first National Security Council memorandum, NSC 1, 1948, specified a number of actions the U.S. would take if the communists won these elections. One planned response was armed intervention by means of military aid for underground operations in Italy. Some people, particularly George Kennan, advocated military action before the elections. He didn't want to take a chance, but others convinced him that we should carry it off by subversion, which turned out to be correct. In Greece, British troops entered after the Nazis had withdrawn. They imposed a corrupt regime that evoked renewed resistance, and Britain, in its post-war decline, was unable to maintain control. In 1947, the United States moved in, supporting a murderous war that resulted in 160,000 deaths. This war was complete with torture, political exile for tens of thousands of Greeks, what we called re-education camps for tens of thousands of others, and the destruction of unions and any possibility of independent politics. It placed Greece firmly in the hands of U.S. investors and local businessmen, while much of the population had to immigrate in order to survive. The beneficiaries included Nazi collaborators, while the primary victims were the workers and the peasants of the communist-led anti-Nazi resistance. Our successful defense of Greece against its own population was the model for the Vietnam War. As Adlai Stevenson explained to the United Nations in 1964, Reagan's advisors used exactly the same model in talking about Central America, and the pattern was followed in many other places. Tried and true, folks, tried and true. In Japan, Washington initiated the so-called reverse course of 1947 that terminated early steps towards democratization taken by General MacArthur's military administration. The reverse course suppressed the unions and other democratic forces that placed the country firmly in the hands of corporate elements that had backed Japanese fascism, a system of state and private power that still endures. When U.S. forces entered Korea in 1945, they dispersed the local popular government, consisting primarily of anti-fascists who resisted the Japanese, and inaugurated a brutal repression using Japanese fascist police and Koreans who had collaborated with them during the Japanese occupation. About 100,000 people were murdered in South Korea prior to what we call the Korean War, including 30 to 40,000 killed during the suppression of a peasant revolt in one small region, Jeju Island. A fascist coup in Colombia, inspired by Franco's Spain, brought little protest from the U.S. government. Neither did a military coup in Venezuela, nor the restoration of an admirer of fascism in Panama. But the first democratic government in the history of Guatemala, which modeled itself on Roosevelt's New Deal, elicited bitter U.S. antagonism. In 1954, the CIA engineered a coup that turned Guatemala into a hell on earth. It's been kept that way ever since, with regular U.S. intervention and support, particularly under Kennedy and Johnson. One aspect of suppressing the anti-fascist resistance was the recruitment of war criminals like Klaus Barbie, an SS officer who had been the Gestapo chief of Lyon, France, where he earned his nickname, the Butcher of Lyon. Although he was responsible for many hideous crimes, the U.S. Army put him in charge of spying on the French. When Barbie was finally brought back to France in 1982 to be tried as a war criminal, his use as an agent was explained by Colonel Eugene Kolb of the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps. Barbie's skills were badly needed. His activities had been directed against the underground French Communist Party and the resistance, who were now targeted for repression by the American liberators. Since the United States was picking up where the Nazis had left off, it made perfect sense to employ specialists in anti-resistance activities. Later on, when it became difficult or impossible to protect these useful folks in Europe, many of them, including Barbie, were spirited off to the United States or to Latin America, often with the help of the Vatican and fascist priests. There they became military advisors to U.S.-supported police states that were modeled often quite openly on the Third Reich. They also became drug dealers, weapons merchants, terrorists, and educators, teaching Latin American peasants torture techniques devised by the Gestapo. Some of the Nazi students ended up in Central America, thus establishing a direct link between the death camps and the death squads, all thanks to the post-war alliance between the United States and the SS. Our commitment to democracy. And one high-level document after another, U.S. planners stated their view that the primary threat to the new U.S.-led world order was third world nationalism, sometimes called ultra-nationalism, nationalistic regimes that are responsive to, quote, popular demand for immediate improvement in the low living standards of the masses, end quote, and production for domestic needs. What? The gall of these people. No, I'm just kidding. The planners' basic goals, repeated over and over again, were to prevent such ultra-nationalist regimes from ever taking power, or if by some fluke they did take power, to remove them and install governments that favor private investment of domestic and foreign capital, production for export, and the right to bring profits out of the country. These goals are never challenged in the secret documents. If you're a U.S. policy planner, they're sort of like the air you breathe. Opposition to democracy and social reform is never popular in the victim country. You can't get many of the people living there excited about it, except a small group connected with U.S. businesses who are going to profit from it. The United States expects to rely on force and makes alliances with the military, the least anti-American of any political group in Latin America, unquote, as the Kennedy planners put it, so they can be relied on to crush any indigenous popular groups that get out of hand. The U.S. has been willing to tolerate social reform, as in Costa Rica, for example, only when the rights of labor are suppressed and the ultimate and the climate for foreign investment is preserved. Because the Costa Rican government has always respected these two crucial imperatives, it's been allowed to play around with its reforms. Another problem that's pointed to over and over again in these secret documents is the excessive liberalism of third world countries. That was particularly a problem in Latin America, where the governments weren't sufficiently committed to thought control and restrictions on travel, and where the legal systems were so deficient that they required evidence for the prosecution of crimes. It's an outrage. They required evidence. This is a constant lament right through the Kennedy period. After that, the documentary record hasn't yet been declassified. We're still waiting for them to declassify that stuff, but I don't know, the way things are going now, it's going to be a while. The Kennedy liberals were adamant about the need to overcome democratic excesses that permitted subversion, by which, of course, they meant people thinking the wrong ideas. The United States was not, however, lacking in compassion for the poor. For example, in the mid-1950s, our ambassador to Costa Rica recommended that the United Fruit Company, which basically ran Costa Rica, introduce a few relatively simple and superficial human interest frills for the workers that may have a large psychological effect. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles agreed, telling President Eisenhower that to keep Latin Americans in line, quote, you have to pat them a little bit and make them think that you're fond of them, end quote. Given all that, U.S. policies in the third world are easy to understand. Given all that, U.S. policies in the third world are easy to understand. So file this stuff in memory when you're reading the news, it's like, and you notice that the people in the picture from Venezuela are all obese, are supposed to be starving, and they don't say anything about Yemen. Venezuela has adopted policies that resulted in Venezuelans getting a lot of food to eat, so that obesity is, 25%. That's why when you see the pictures of Venezuelans, a lot of them are fat. 1 in 4 are not just overweight, folks, obese. And that shows evil effects of communist policies. We've consistently opposed democracy if its results can't be controlled. The problem with real democracies is that they're likely to fall prey to the heresy that governments should respond to the needs of their own population instead of those of U.S. investors. A study of the inter-American system published by the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London concluded that while the U.S. pays lip service to democracy, the real commitment is to private capitalist enterprise. When the rights of investors are threatened, democracy has to go. If these rights are safeguarded, killers and torturers will do just fine. Parliamentary governments were barred or overthrown with U.S. support and sometimes direct intervention. In Iran in 1953, in Guatemala in 1954, and in 1963 when Kennedy backed a military coup to prevent the threat of return to democracy, in the Dominican Republic in 1963 and 1965, in Brazil in 1964, in Chile in 1973, and often elsewhere. Our policies have been very much the same in El Salvador and many other places across the globe. The methods are not very pretty. What the U.S.-run Contra forces did in Nicaragua, or what our terrorist proxies do in El Salvador or Guatemala, isn't only ordinary killing. A major element is brutal sadistic torture, beating infants against rocks, hanging women by their feet with their breasts cut off and the skin of their face peeled back so that they'll bleed to death, chopping people's heads off and putting them on stakes. The point is to crush independent nationalism and popular forces that might bring about meaningful democracy. The threat of a good example. The threats of a good example. No country is exempt from this treatment, no matter how unimportant. In fact, it's the weakest, poorest countries that often arouse the greatest hysteria. Take Laos in the 1960s, probably the poorest country in the world. Most of the people who lived there didn't even know there was such a thing as Laos. They just knew they had a little village and there was another little village nearby. But as soon as a very low-level social revolution began to develop there, Washington subjected Laos to a murderous secret bombing, virtually wiping out large settled areas in operations that it was conceded had nothing to do with the war the U.S. was waging in South Vietnam. Grenada has 100,000 people who produce a little nutmeg, and you could hardly find it on a map. But when Grenada began to undergo a mild social revolution, Washington quickly moved to destroy the threats. From the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 till the collapse of the communist governments in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, it was possible to justify every U.S. attack as a defense against the Soviet threat. So when the United States invaded Grenada in 1983, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff explained that in the event of a Soviet attack on Western Europe, a hostile Grenada could interdict oil supplies from the Caribbean to Western Europe, and we wouldn't be able to defend our beleaguered allies. Now, this sounds comical, but that kind of story helps mobilize public support for aggression, terror, and subversion. The attack against Nicaragua was justified by the claim that if we don't stop them there, they'll be pouring across the border at Harlingen, Texas, just 2 days' drive away. For educated people, there were more sophisticated variants, just about as plausible. As far as American business is concerned, Nicaragua could disappear. Nobody would notice. The same is true of El Salvador. But both have been subjected to murderous assaults by the United States at a cost of hundreds of thousands of lives and many billions of dollars. There's a reason for that. The weaker and poorer a country is, the more dangerous it is as an example. It's like a domino. A little tiny domino could tip over. As an example, if a tiny poor country like Grenada can succeed in bringing about a better life for its people, some other place that has more resources will ask, hey, why not us? This was even true in Indochina, which is pretty big and has some significant resources. Although Eisenhower and his advisors ranted a lot about the rice, tin, and rubber, the real fear was that if the people in Indochina achieved independence and justice, the people of Thailand would emulate it. And if that worked, they'd try it in Malaya. Pretty soon, Indonesia would pursue an independent path. And by then, a significant area of the Grand Area would have been lost. Lost! If you want a global system that's subordinated to the needs of U.S. investors, you can't let pieces of it wander off. It's striking how clearly this is stated in the documentary record, even in the public record at times. Take Chile under Allende. Chile is a fairly big place with a lot of natural resources, but again, the United States wasn't going to collapse if Chile became independent. Why were we so concerned about it? According to Kissinger, Chile was a virus that would infect the region with effects all the way to Italy. Despite 40 years of CIA subversion, Italy still has a labor movement. Seeing a social democratic government succeed in Chile would send the wrong message to Italian voters. Suppose they get funny ideas about taking control of their own country and revive the workers' movements the CIA undermined in the 1940s. U.S. planners from Secretary of State Denny Atchison in the late 1940s to the present have warned that one rotten apple can spoil the barrel. The danger is that the rot, social and economic development, may spread. This rotten apple theory is called the domino theory for public consumption. The version used to frighten the public has Ho Chi Minh getting in a canoe and landing in California, and so on. Maybe some U.S. leaders believe this nonsense. It's possible. But rational planners certainly don't. They understand that the real threat is the, quote, good example. Sometimes the point is explained with great clarity. When the U.S. was planning to overthrow Guatemalan democracy in 1954, a State Department official pointed out that, quote, Guatemala has become an increasing threat to the stability of Honduras and El Salvador. Its agrarian reform is a powerful propaganda weapon. Its broad social program of aiding the workers and peasants in a victorious struggle against the upper classes and large foreign enterprises has a strong appeal to the populations of Central American neighbors where similar conditions prevail. End quote. In other words, what the U.S. wants is, quote, stability, meaning security for the, quote, upper classes and large foreign enterprises, unquote. If that can be achieved with formal democratic devices, okay. If not, the threat to stability posed by a good example has to be destroyed before the virus infects others. That's why even the tiniest speck poses such a threat and may have to be crushed. The three-sided world. From the early 1970s, the world has been drifting to what's called tripolarism or trilateralism, three major economic blocs that compete with each other. The first is a yen-based bloc with Japan as its center and the former Japanese colonies on the periphery. Back in the 30s and 40s, Japan called that the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The conflict with the U.S. arose from Japan's attempt to exercise the same kind of control there that the Western powers exercised in their own spheres. But after the war, we reconstructed the region for them. We then had no problem with Japan exploiting it. They just had to do it under our overarching power. There's a lot of nonsense written about how the fact that Japan became a major competitor proves how honorable we are and how we built up our enemies. The actual policy options, however, were narrower. One was to restore Japan's empire, but now all under our control. This was the policy that was followed. The other option was to keep out of the region and allow Japan and the rest of Asia to follow their independent paths, excluded from the grand area of U.S. control. That was unthinkable. Furthermore, after World War II, Japan was not regarded as a possible competitor, even in the remote future. It was assumed that maybe somewhere down the road, Japan would be able to produce knickknacks, but nothing beyond that. There was a strong element of racism in this. Japan recovered in large part because of the Korean War and then the Vietnam War, which stimulated Japanese production and brought Japan huge profits. A few of the early post-war planners were more farsighted, George Kennan among them. He proposed that the United States encourage Japan to industrialize, but with one limit. The U.S. would control Japanese oil imports. Kennan said that this would allow us veto power over Japan in case it ever got out of line. The U.S. followed this advice, keeping control over Japan's oil supplies and refineries. As late as the early 1970s, Japan still controlled only about 10% of its own oil supplies. That's one of the main reasons the United States has been so interested in Middle Eastern oil. We didn't need the oil for ourselves until 1968. North America led world oil production. But we do want to keep our hands on this lever of world power and make sure the profits flow primarily to the U.S. and Britain. That's one reason why we have maintained military bases in the Philippines. They're part of a global intervention system aimed at the Middle East to make sure indigenous forces there don't succumb to ultra-nationalism. Think about it. The second major competitive bloc is based in Europe and is dominated by Germany. It's taking a big step forward with the consolidation of the European common market. Europe has a larger economy than the United States, a larger population, and a better educated one. If it ever gets its act together and becomes an integrated power, the United States could become a second-class power. This is even more likely as German-led Europe takes the lead in restoring Eastern Europe to its traditional role as an economic colony. Basically, part of the Third World. The third bloc is the U.S.-dominated dollar-based one. It was recently extended to incorporate Canada, our major trading partner, and will include Mexico and other parts of the hemisphere through free trade agreements designed primarily for the interest of U.S. investors and their associates. We've always assumed Latin America belongs to us by right, as Henry Stimson, Secretary of War under FDR, and Taft, Secretary of State under Hoover, once put it, "It's our little region over there which has never bothered anybody." Securing the dollar-based bloc means that the drive to thwart independent development in Central America and the Caribbean will continue. Unless you understand our struggles against our industrial rivals in the Third World, U.S. foreign policy appears to be a series of random errors, inconsistencies, and confusions. Actually, our leaders have succeeded rather well at their assigned chores within the limits of feasibility. Devastation abroad. Our good neighbor policy. Good neighbor, State Farm is there. How well have the precepts put forth by George Kennan been followed? How thoroughly have we put aside all concern for vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization? I've already discussed our commitment to democracy, but what about the other two issues? Let's focus on Latin America and begin by looking at human rights. A study by Lars Schultz the leading academic specialist on human rights there, shows that U.S. aid has tended to flow disproportionately to Latin American governments which torture their citizens. It has nothing to do with how much the country needs aid, only with its willingness to serve the interests of wealth and privilege. Broader studies by economist Edward Herman reveal a close correlation worldwide between torture and U.S. aid, and also provide the explanation. Both correlate independently with improving the climate for business operations. In comparison with that guiding moral principle, such matters as torture and butchery pale into insignificance. How about raising living standards? That was supposedly addressed by President Kennedy's Alliance for Progress, but the kind of development imposed was oriented mostly towards the needs of U.S. investors. It entrenched and extended the existing system in which Latin Americans are made to produce crops for export and cut back on subsistent crops like corn and beans grown for local consumption. Under alliance programs, for example, beef production increased while beef consumption declined. This agro-export model of development usually produces an economic miracle where the GNP goes up, while much of the population starves. When you pursue such policies, popular opposition inevitably develops, which you then suppress with terror and torture. The use of terror is deeply ingrained in our character. Back in 1818, John Quincy Adams hailed the salutary efficacy of terror in dealing with mingled hordes of lawless Indians and Negroes. He wrote that to justify Andrew Jackson's rampages in Florida, which virtually annihilated the native population and left the Spanish province under U.S. control, much impressing Thomas Jefferson and others with his wisdom. The first step is to use the police. They're critical because they can detect discontent early and eliminate it before major surgery, as the planning documents call it, is necessary. If major surgery does become necessary, we rely on the army, and we can no longer control the army as of a Latin American country, particularly one in the Caribbean Central American region. It's time to overthrow the government. Countries that have attempted to reverse the pattern, such as Guatemala under the democratic capitalist governments Arevalo and Arbenz, or the Dominican Republic under the democratic capitalist regime of Bosch, became the target of U.S. hostility and violence. The second step is to use the military. The U.S. always tried to establish relationships with the military in foreign countries because that's one of the ways to overthrow a government that has gotten out of hand. That's how the basis was laid for military coups in Chile in 1973 and Indonesia in 1965. Before the coups, we were very hostile to the Chilean and Indonesian governments, but we continued to send them arms, keep good relations with the right officers, and they overthrow the government for you. The same reasoning motivated the flow of U.S. arms to Iran via Israel from the early 1980s. According to high Israeli officials involved, facts well known by 1982, long before there were any hostages. During the Kennedy administration, the mission of the U.S.-dominated Latin American military was shifted from hemispheric defense to internal security, which basically means war against our own population. That fateful decision led to U.S. complicity in the methods of Heinrich Himmler's extermination squads. In the retrospective judgment of Charles Mechring, who was in charge of counterinsurgency planning from 1961 to 66. The Kennedy administration prepared the way for the 1964 military coup in Brazil, helping to destroy Brazilian democracy, which was becoming too independent. The U.S. gave enthusiastic support to the coup while its military leaders instituted a neo-Nazi-style national security state with torture, repression, etc., that inspired a rash of similar developments in Argentina, Chile, and all over the hemisphere from the mid-60s to the 80s, an extremely bloody period. I think, legally speaking, there's a very solid case for impeaching every American president since the Second World War. They've all been either outright war criminals or involved in serious war crimes. The military typically proceeds to create an economic disaster, often following the prescriptions of U.S. advisors, then decides to hand the problem over to civilians to administer. Overt military control is no longer necessary as new devices become available. For example, controls exercised through the International Monetary Fund, which, like the World Bank, lends third world nations funds largely provided by the industrial powers. In return for its loans, the IMF imposes liberalization, an economy open to foreign penetration and control, sharp cutbacks in services to the general populations, etc. These measures place power even more firmly in the hands of the wealthy classes and foreign investors. Stability and reinforce the classic two-tiered societies of the third world. The super rich and a relatively well-off professional class that serves them, and an enormous mass of impoverished, suffering people. The indebtedness and economic chaos left by the military pretty much ensures that the IMF rules will be followed. Unless popular forces attempt to enter the political arena, in which case the military may have to reinstate stability. Brazil is an instructive case. It is so well endowed with natural resources that it ought to be one of the richest countries in the world. And it also has high industrial development. But thanks in a good measure to the 1964 coup and the highly praised economic miracle that followed, not to speak of the torture, murder, and other devices of population control, the situation for many Brazilians is now probably on a par with Ethiopia, vastly worse than in Eastern Europe, for example. The Ministry of Education reports that over a third of the education budgets goes to school meals because most of the students in public schools either eat at school or not at all. According to South Magazine, a business magazine reporting on the third world, Brazil has a higher infant mortality rate than Sri Lanka. A third of the population now lives below the poverty line, and 7 million abandoned children beg, steal, and sniff glue on the streets. For scores of millions, home is a shack in a slum or increasingly a patch of ground under a bridge. That's Brazil, one of the naturally richest countries in the world. There you have it. The situation is similar throughout Latin America. Just in Central America, the number of people murdered by U.S.-backed forces since the late 1970s comes to something like 200,000. As popular movements that sought democracy and social reform were decimated, these achievements qualify the U.S. as an inspiration for the triumph of democracy in our time. In the admiring words of the liberal New Republic, Tom Wolfe tells us, the 1980s were one of the greatest golden moments that humanity has ever experienced. As Stalin used to say, we're dizzy with success. The crucifixion of El Salvador. For many years, repression, torture, and murder were carried on in El Salvador by dictators installed and supported by our government. A matter of no interest here. The story was virtually never covered. By the late 1970s, however, the U.S. government began to be concerned about a couple of things. One was that Somoza, the dictator of Nicaragua, was losing control. The U.S. was losing a major base for its exercise of force in the region. A second danger was even more threatening. In El Salvador, in the 1970s, there was a growth of what were called popular organizations, peasant associations, cooperatives, unions, church-based Bible study groups that evolved into self-help groups, etc., that raised the threat of democracy. In February 1980, the Archbishop of El Salvador, Oscar Romero, sent a letter to President Carter. Oh, President Carter, I'm writing to you because you're so wonderful, in which he begged him not to send military aid to the junta that ran the country. He said such aid would be used to sharpen injustice and repression against the people's organizations which were struggling for respect for their most basic human rights. Hardly news to Washington, needless to say. A few weeks later, Archbishop Romero was assassinated while saying a mass. The neo-Nazi Roberto Dobison is generally assumed to be responsible for this assassination, among countless other atrocities. Dobison was leader for life of the Arena Party, which now governs El Salvador. Members of the party, like current Salvadoran President Alfredo Christianity, had to take a blood oath of loyalty to him. Thousands of peasants and urban poor took part in a commemorative mass a decade later, along with many foreign bishops, but the U.S. was notable by its absence. The Salvadoran Church formally proposed Romero for sainthood. All this passed with scarcely a mention in the country that funded and trained Romero's assassins. The New York Times, the newspaper of record, published no editorial on the assassination when it occurred, or in the years that followed, and no editorial or news report on the commemoration. On March 7, 1980, 2 weeks before the assassination, a state of siege had been instituted in El Salvador, and the war against the population began in force with continued U.S. support and involvement. The first major attack was a big massacre of the Rio Sumpul, a coordinated military operation of the Honduran and Salvadoran armies in which at least 600 people were butchered. Infants were cut to pieces with machetes, and women were tortured and drowned. Pieces of bodies were found in the river for days afterwards. There were church observers, so the information came out immediately, but the mainstream U.S. media didn't think it worth reporting. Not fit to print. Peasants were the main victims of this war, along with labor organizers, students, priests, or anyone suspected of working for the interests of the people. In Carter's last year, 1980, the death toll reached about 10,000, rising to about 13,000 for 1981 as the Reaganites took command. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the next conclusion of the following episode of the Reading Kaufman of the World show that this is. Join us again next time when we continue the explanation of things in the world for your edification, and hope you will consider the ramifications with respect to these edifications. Until then, goodbye.